The dog was placed with its head near the man's hand. Not thrown in. Not dumped outside with the refuse. Placed inside a human grave. Beside it lay a man and a woman, surrounded by worked ornaments and red ochre, the marks of a burial prepared with care. And curled there among them was a young dog, 7 or 8 months old, barely out of puppyhood. It should not have been there. This was 14,000 years ago, before farming, before pottery, before villages or granaries, before anything we would recognize as settled life. The ice was still pulling back from Europe, and someone in that world stood over a hole in the cold ground with a dead puppy in their arms and decided that this creature belonged with their dead. Every practical instinct said the opposite. An animal carcass drew scavengers. It carried sickness. It was meat, or it was waste. It was not something you spent labor and precious ochre placing beside your own mother or husband in the earth. They did it anyway. And the reason has almost nothing to do with the story we usually tell about how dogs came to us. The explanation is comfortable, and it is clean, and it falls apart the moment you put weight on it. We say, humans needed hunting partners, so we tamed wolves. A trade. The animal gets food, the people get a nose and a set of teeth. Everybody profits. It sounds exactly like what a rational species would do. Start with the timing, because the timing alone is fatal to it. The dog is the first domestic animal on Earth, and it is not close. Every sheep, every goat, every pig, every cow, every grain of wheat and barley comes thousands of years afterward. All of them bound up with farming, with settlement, with staying in one place long enough to control what breeds with what. The dog arrives before all of it. It arrives while our kind is still following herds across a frozen world with everything we own on our backs. Which means the entire apparatus that domestication is supposed to require did not exist yet. Nobody had a surplus. There was no grain store, no pen, no herd to spare from. In a season when a band might not reach spring, every scrap thrown to an animal was a scrap taken from a child. Nobody had a breeding program, because nobody had a place to keep breeding stock or a way to stop it wandering off. Nobody had leisure. And into that world, the least likely world imaginable for a long-term animal project, walked the single most consequential relationship our species has ever formed with another. The story we tell has us domesticating the wolf when we were least capable of domesticating anything at all. Look at what turning a wolf into a dog actually demands of the person attempting it, and the story stops being merely unlikely and becomes impossible. Domestication is not taming. Taming is one animal, one lifetime. You can gentle a wild creature, and it stays a wild creature, and its pups are born as wild as their grandparents. Domestication is a change to the population itself, written into the bone and the brain, and it takes generations. Many of them. Far more than any single person could live to see, or steer, or even notice was underway. So picture the plan this theory requires. A hunter on the Ice Age steppe decides to begin a project whose payoff will arrive long after his grandchildren are dead. For an animal that does not yet exist, whose usefulness he has never witnessed because nothing like it has ever walked the earth. He commits his family's food to it, through winters that kill, on faith in a result he cannot describe. No one did that. No one could have. There was nothing to aim at. No dog anywhere in the world to serve as the goal. No example to point to. No way to know that the thing at the end of the process would be worth a single bone. The dog was not something we made. It was something that happened to us. And the evidence for how points somewhere nobody expects. We did not go out and get them. They came to us. Wherever people camped, people left things behind. Marrow-cracked bone, hide trimmings, gut, the debris of butchery too poor to carry and far too rich to ignore. To a wolf, a human camp was not a threat to be circled at distance. It was a reliable pile of calories, in a world where reliability was the rarest thing in existence. Worth more than richness, worth more than size, because it came back. But that food had a filter on it, and the filter is the whole story. Only certain wolves could take it. Most could not get close enough. Flight distance is not a decision an animal makes. It is wiring, set deep, varying from individual to individual, the way it varies in every population of every species. The jumpy ones stayed out in the dark and ate what they could catch. But among any group of wolves there are outliers. A few that are simply, constitutionally, less afraid. Calmer, slower to bolt. Able to hold at 40 paces, where the rest of their kind would not hold at 400. Those wolves ate. The others did not. And an animal that eats better raises more pups that survive. Pups carrying the same steady nerves that let their parents sit close to people and stay. Run that for enough generations and nobody has tamed anything. A door was left open, and the calmest wolves walked through it under their own power, growing fractionally less afraid every century, because being less afraid was what the food rewarded. Nobody chose this. Nobody could have. The wolves chose it, one meal at a time, across more years than any person could count. But this explains a scavenger. It explains an animal that tolerates us for our garbage. It does not explain ochre. It does not explain a puppy laid beside a man's hand in a grave. Something else happened, and it happened inside the animal's head. The dog learned to look at our faces. That sentence sounds soft. It is the hardest thing in this entire story, and it is the hinge on which everything turns. Set an unsolvable puzzle in front of a wolf. A box it cannot open, a problem with no answer, and the wolf works at it. It pulls, it digs, it circles, it applies itself until it exhausts the possibilities and quits. What it does not do is turn around and look at the human being standing behind it. The person is not part of the wolf's solution space. The person is furniture, or the person is a threat, but the person is never a source of answers. Put the same puzzle in front of a dog, and the dog fails at it, then stops, then turns, then looks up into a human face. That is a question. An actual question, asked without language, by an animal that has decided a human mind might contain what its own mind lacks. Nothing else on earth does this with us. And it goes further than asking, because a dog will follow a pointed finger, will understand that a human arm extended in space is not a gesture, but a reference, meaning there, look there, the thing you want is over there. We forget how astonishing this is because it is the first trick every child teaches every puppy. So measure it against our own family. Our closest primate relatives, the apes we share the overwhelming majority of our DNA with, largely fail this. Point for a chimpanzee, and it will often look at the finger. The gesture does not resolve. The idea that another creature's attention can be aimed like a tool, and that you can ride along that aim to something you want, does not come naturally to our own cousins. It comes naturally to the animal at your feet. Something crossed over. Somewhere in that long, unplanned drift from the refuse pile to the fireside, a predator stopped treating us as terrain and started treating us as minds. Reading where our eyes went, understanding that our attention meant something, asking us for help. It entered the one space no other species has ever entered. And having found the way in, it started rebuilding its own face to stay there. Look at the head of a dog, then at the head of a wolf. The differences are not cosmetic. The muzzle has shortened. The skull is smaller relative to the body. The teeth are reduced, crowded into a jaw that no longer needs to be an instrument for killing large animals. The whole architecture of the head has softened. The machinery of a predator quietly disassembled across thousands of generations. But the change that matters is above the eyes. Dogs have a small muscle around the inner brow that wolves largely lack. A muscle whose entire function is to lift the inner corner of the eyebrow. It does nothing for hunting. It does nothing for eating, or fighting, or surviving a winter. What it does is produce a specific expression. The eyes widen, the brow rises, the face acquires that helpless, pleading, unbearably readable quality. The look that stops a person in a doorway. The look that has never once, in the entire history of our species, failed to work. That muscle exists because it functioned. Read that again slowly, because it is the coldest and most extraordinary fact in this whole investigation. Dogs that could make that face got fed. They got kept. They got let in closer, and closer, and eventually inside. The ones that could not make it got less. Less food, less shelter, less of the warmth at the center of the human circle, and left fewer descendants to inherit their flatter, wolfish brows. Across thousands of generations, an animal's skull physically reshaped itself around a single task, reaching into a human heart. The dog did not learn a trick. It evolved a way to be loved. The eyes that find yours across a room tonight are the finished product of that long reaching. A piece of anatomy grown, over unimaginable time, for the specific purpose of making you unable to look away. Here is the part that should unsettle you. The same suite of changes that softened the wolf into the dog, shorter jaw, lighter build, reduced teeth, a drop in reactive aggression, appears in us. Compare a modern human skull with those from the deep past, and our own faces have gentled. The heavy brow ridge receded, the jaw lightened. The whole face grew less armored, less combative, more childlike in its proportions, across the same long span of our history. We call it self-domestication. The species that could tolerate strangers, cooperate with non-kin, and sit in a crowd without violence, out-survived the ones that could not, and it wrote itself into our bones, exactly as it wrote itself into theirs. So the animal that came in from the dark did not arrive to a species that was standing still. Two lineages softened, each on its own schedule, each becoming easier to live beside. Not in step, not by any shared design. But by the time that puppy was placed in the Rhine Valley grave, there were two creatures on that landscape whose faces had both been quietly rebuilt by the same pressure. The enormous evolutionary payoff of being the kind of thing that others let close. Which brings us back to the grave. Because none of this, not the scavenging, not the face reading, not the eyebrow, not the softened skull, explains the ochre. An animal can earn its scraps. An animal can earn a place by the fire. Nothing in the biology explains why anyone would spend the labor of digging frozen ground to put a dog inside a human grave. For that, you have to look at the puppy's teeth. The teeth are where the case breaks open, and they do it quietly. When they examined that young dog, the enamel, the growth of the jaw, the record a body keeps of its own bad years, they found damage, not injury, illness. The particular scarring left behind by canine distemper, a disease that tears through a young dog with fever and seizures and wasting, and kills the overwhelming majority of the puppies it touches. And the damage was not from one episode. The teeth record repeated bouts of it, spread across weeks. Understand what that means before you go any further. This animal did not catch a sickness and shrug it off. It went down, badly, and came back, and went down again, and came back again, over a stretch of time long enough to be written permanently into its skull. It was somewhere between 4 and 5 months old when this was happening. A puppy. And it survived it. That is the fact that ends the argument, because a puppy in that condition cannot survive it alone. Not for a day, certainly not for weeks. Distemper does not permit an animal to look after itself. That is the entire horror of it. A dog in the grip of it cannot eat properly. The fever takes the appetite, the mouth and the nose crust and thicken. The swallowing goes wrong. It cannot hold its own temperature. A young animal that's sick loses heat and cannot generate it back. And on a European landscape still shedding the last of the Ice Age, a body that cannot keep its own warmth is a body on a very short clock. It cannot travel. It cannot follow a band that must move to eat. It cannot hunt, cannot guard, cannot warn, cannot carry, cannot give one single thing back to anyone. And it makes a mess. That is the part nobody says out loud. So say it. An animal that's sick fouls itself. Constantly. For weeks. And someone has to deal with that. Someone did. Someone knelt over a shaking puppy on cold ground and got water into it when it could not drink properly, which means holding a struggling, feverish animal and working liquid into a mouth that did not want it, and doing it again an hour later, and an hour after that, because that is the only way a body that will not drink stays alive. Someone kept it warm when it could not warm itself. Not once. Every night, for weeks. Which means someone gave up part of their own heat, in their own sleep, to an animal that was probably going to die anyway. Someone cleaned it. Someone cleaned up what a distempered puppy produces, and then did it the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. And when the band had to move, because in that world the band always had to move, because the food walked and you followed it or you starved, someone carried it. A sick puppy of that age is not a light thing to carry. And hands that are carrying a dog are hands that are not carrying gear, or a child, or meat. Somebody in that group absorbed that cost, over and over, across the whole length of an illness that had every reason to kill. Now weigh it against the world it happened in. This was a life measured in calories, and every one of them was counted. Every mouthful of water was fetched. Every ounce of warmth was paid for in wood that had to be found and carried in a place where trees were not guaranteed. Every hour spent nursing was an hour not spent hunting, not spent working hide, not spent watching the horizon for the things that hunted people. These were not people with a spare afternoon. There was no such thing as a spare afternoon, and they spent it, on a puppy, for weeks, while it was dying. That is not a resource decision. There is no version of the accounting where this makes sense. So look at what the easy story now has to survive. The tale you walked in with says people took wolves in because wolves were useful. A nose, a set of teeth, an alarm, a hunting partner. Fine. Then explain this animal. At 4 months old, drowning in fever, it had never hunted anything. It had never guarded anything. It had no nose worth using and no teeth worth fearing. And it was, in every measurable sense, worth less than nothing to the people around it. It consumed. It produced nothing. It slowed them down. And its prospects, on any honest reckoning anyone could have made at the time, were death. Nobody nurses a hunting implement through a fever. You do not sit up night after night with a tool. You do not carry a broken instrument across frozen ground while your own children walk. When a thing you own for its usefulness stops being useful and starts costing you, you put it down. That is what usefulness means. That is the whole of what it means. They did not put it down. Which tells us, plainly, physically, in a way no interpretation can wriggle out of, that by 14,000 years ago, this animal had already stopped being a thing that was owned. Somebody looked at a dying puppy and made a decision no ledger can explain. And whatever we want to call that decision, domestication is not the word for it. And the puppy died anyway. It lived to 7 or 8 months, and then the disease, or something after it, took the animal that all those weeks had been spent saving, which left one more decision to make. And the ground records what they chose. Someone had to carry the body. That is where this ends, and it is worth staying with the physical facts of it, because they are all still there in the ground. The animal died. It had to be moved. Someone picked up a dead dog, the same one they had held while it shook, the same one they had cleaned and carried and lost sleep over for weeks, and made a decision about where it went. Everything they knew said outside. A carcass draws scavengers into a camp. It carries disease. In a world where meat was the difference between the living and the dead, a body was either food or it was a hazard, and it was never, under any circumstances, a thing you kept. They kept it. They dug into cold European ground, hours of real labor, with hands and antler and stone, in a season and a place that gave up nothing easily, and they laid a man and a woman in it. Then they laid the dog in with them. Not at the edge, not at the feet. In among the people, close to the man's hand. And they used the ochre. That is the detail that should stop you. Red ochre is not incidental. It had to be found, collected, prepared, carried. A substance these people reserved for the dead who mattered. The pigment of blood and of life, spread across the bodies of their own. They did not ration it here. They did not decide the animal fell short of the things worth spending it on. They treated the dog exactly as they treated their dead, which means, at the moment of burial, the dog was one of their dead. Somebody stood at the edge of that hole in the frozen Rhine Valley, looked down at an animal they had failed to save, and could not make themselves walk away and leave it in the open. That is not husbandry. That is not the management of a resource. That is grief. It is the only word that fits, and it is 14,000 years old. So, how did dogs become our first best friends? Not by being tamed. Nobody tamed them. Nobody alive could have planned a thing that took generations to finish. Not by being useful either, though they were. It began as an accident of garbage and nerve. The calmest wolves finding they could bear our camps, and eating better for it, century after century, until the animal at the edge of the light was no longer quite a wolf. It deepened when that animal did the thing no other species has managed, and looked up into our faces for answers. It deepened again when its own skull began to reshape itself, brow muscle and all, around the business of being let in. But none of that is friendship. All of it is still a transaction, however strange and however slow. The bond became friendship at the exact moment it stopped making sense. The moment the ledger went red and stayed red and nobody closed the account. When a creature that had nothing left to offer, no work, no warning, no meat, no prospect of ever repaying a single calorie, was carried anyway, warmed anyway, cleaned anyway, mourned anyway, and laid in ochre beside a human being. That is the line. Everything before it is biology doing what biology does. Everything after it is us. The dog is our first best friend because it is the first living thing outside our own species that we spent ourselves on when it could give nothing back. Every animal that came after, the sheep, the goat, the cow, the horse, we took for what it produced and let go without a second thought when it stopped producing, because that was the arrangement and both sides, in their way, understood it. The dog was never that. The dog got inside the circle we draw around our people, in the coldest and poorest chapter of our whole history, before we had anything at all to spare, and it has never once been asked to leave. And that is the part that should stay with you longest. We did not open the circle because we could afford to. We opened it when we could least afford to, when every calorie was counted, when the winter killed, when there was no surplus anywhere to soften the cost of a mouth that gave nothing back. This friendship was not born in comfort. It was born in scarcity, which is the only place a gift like it means anything. Anyone can be generous with what they do not need. Those people were generous with what they could not spare. For an animal that could never thank them. And that is the whole of it. Everything else about them is gone. Their language, their names, whatever they believed waited after death. Whatever they called that puppy, if they called it anything, all of it dissolved so completely that we cannot recover a single thought any of them ever had. 14,000 years took the rest. What survived is a hole in the ground, some red pigment, 3 bodies, and a set of damaged teeth that prove somebody stayed up through the nights. And the thing they did is still happening. It happened this morning, in 1,000 kitchens, when someone woke to an animal waiting by the door. It will happen tonight, when someone lowers themselves onto a cold floor beside a dog that is old and failing, a hand resting on fur gone gray at the muzzle, giving everything and receiving nothing but the weight of a head laid across their knee, and stays there long past the point of sense, because getting up and leaving is simply not a thing they can make themselves do. That impulse is not modern. It is not the soft habit of comfortable people with food to waste. It is older than farming, older than the wheel, older than the oldest wall anyone ever raised, and it was already whole, already finished, in whoever knelt over that shaking puppy in the cold, and chose, against every reason they had, to stay. We did not invent it. We inherited it, unbroken, passed hand to hand down 14,000 years, and we pass it on ourselves every time we make the same impossible choice. The rest of their world fell silent long ago. This one thing, they left lying where we would be sure to find it. If the quiet origins of the things we take for granted are what keep you here, stay close. There is another piece of ground waiting, and I would like you with me when we turn it over.